Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Graham Pate.
And I'm Jen Ward.
And according to the slide, we are lead educational developers. That's my dad joke of the day. Thank you very much. So we're going to be talking to you for the next hour and getting you involved in some conversations about how to have some fun and effective forums. So we're going to talk about really five main things. Who is leading the discussion when you're doing a forum? Who is responding in the discussion and how are they responding? How do we weave Indigenous pedagogies into the forums? And we'll be discussing some potential issues and conflicts. So that's kind of the main idea of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off with, well, surprisingly, number one. We're going to do a little interactive poll. So if you go to pollev.com/agpate, that would be me, you'll see this just a very simple poll there. You can answer. When you think about incorporating discussion forums into your course, how does that make you feel? So all you have to do is click on one of the faces. So it's pollev.com/agpate. The capitals don't really matter. Okay, interesting responses. I'm just going to share the screen here so we can just see what the responses are. It's very interesting responses. So you can see all those little circles that you see, these little, I don't know, pinpoints are responses. So what is very interesting is that the majority of folk feel mostly okay, mediocre about it. 1, 2 people, 4 people, a bit more unhappy faces. But on the whole, neutral to positive, which is very interesting.
I find that that's interesting because I've had lots of conversations through consultations where folks don't want to engage in discussion forums, or they're saying students don't like the discussion forums. So maybe some of you have heard those things too from your students. I don't want to do this. I don't like doing this. And if that's the case, we can chat about that. We're going to have some other interactive pieces where you'll get to share your thoughts around that.
But it's interesting that for those of you who were on the kind of the negative side, you're not alone. And those of you who are on the positive side, you don't have to feel guilty for being positive about wanting to use them either. So there's hopefully in the next hour, we'll give you some ideas that might help shift you towards more of a happy face. We're going to talk about different types of forums, but the one that we're probably most used to is the instructor-led forum. The forum where you're kind of calling the shots. You're setting the task. So now, if we look at it from the very traditional point of view, what we're all very used to, the answer is, this is the task you give the students. Here's a question, answer it. Or here are a set of questions, answer them. Nothing wrong with that at all. But if we're talking about fun, engaging, and effective forums, perhaps there are other ways to have a task in a forum which goes beyond this or does something different than this. So for example, maybe you give students a case study and you ask them to analyze it. Maybe depending on the case study, they solve it, if it is a solvable case study. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a case study that asks them to think of their own opinions, which links very well to my next idea, which is a scenario. Give them a scenario and say, reflect on this. What is your opinion on this? Based upon the readings that we've been doing, and then looking at the scenario, what research would you use to help answer this question or help to support this question or to respond to this scenario? You could give the students an opportunity to argue a position. You could give the students a quote and ask them to unpack it. What is your interpretation of this quote? Now, not all of these will work in every situation, obviously, but depending on your own subject matter, you may think that one is more appropriate than the other, or some are more appropriate than the others. You might want to have the students to opine about an item. So give an opinion about this particular artwork. What is your, again, based upon the readings that we've done and the discussions we've had in previous weeks, what is your opinion of this artwork based upon what we've learned about pointillism, for example? So these are just some ideas, certainly not all of them, but these are some ideas that you might want to think about when you are creating a task for a forum. Jen.
What would student-led forums look like? So what if we asked the students to set the task or to pose the questions? So the way that I do mine, and this is just an example, this is, not something you have to do. I have the students work in groups. So they're a group of 4 students. They are managing the discussion for that week. They only have 1 week where they need to be in charge of that. And once they're done, they're done. But because of the way eClass is set up, only 1 student can actually post the questions. So within their group, they need to post that. So the students in the other groups, so I have students set up in groups from the beginning of the course. And of course, you have to maintain if new students come in or students drop within the first couple of weeks, right? You need to sort of do a little bit of maintenance there. The students in the other groups must individually provide a response to the task. So they're responding individually, not as a group. They need to also respond to another student's response. So it's not just this one-way response, it's actually creating a discussion. So I set out the rules of engagement, the parameters for the students. This is how this will work. Give them an example of what that looks like. Because of course there's going to be all those questions and gaps, right, in our instructions that happen. And I like the idea of them collaborating together and them really working through maybe some of their thoughts, their questions, their critiques of the resources for the week. I've also created a private discussion forum for each group to create their questions to be posted. So within everything's embedded in eClass. They don't have to go elsewhere. Everything's contained in that space. You could also ask them to create their own Google Doc space if you didn't want to set up this other discussion. But what I like about this is I can see what's going on in their groups. I can look in, I can check, see if they're having any problems. I check on the groups before they post. So there is a little bit of energy and time that I need to put into each group. But over these 11 weeks, because I'm teaching at Augustana this semester, we only had 10 weeks of discussions. So that was 10 check-ins. And you could have the students submit in advance. You could ask them to submit their questions to you. You could approve them. I didn't do that. I have found an issue with that. And it was an issue in my own thinking or pre-thinking about the discussion groups. And that was the fact that I didn't tell students that they needed to address all the resources for that week. So I'm teaching a split class, a 101 and a 201. The 101 students decided mostly to address one reading or one resource for that week rather than addressing questions for all of the resources. But the 201 group was able to work through that themselves. And of course, that's their scaffolding and knowledge and where they're at in their learning journey. But that was something that I needed to ensure that they did from the very beginning. So here's an example of a private group discussion space. So I have the rules of engagement up at the top. You're all going to get these slides. So if it looks like just a bunch of really tiny letters right now, not to worry, because you'll be able to see this. And then I have each group. So here's week 5 discussion questions. The students are in there, and you can see from the one group, they were having lots of dialogue. Week 3, the students actually took their discussion into Google. So that was the one message that was in there. And then they had the other 7, everybody checking in, here's my email, all that kind of stuff. That was the same group. How do we connect with one another? And so I found that to be effective for most groups, and I could go in and check on them. And then I think I have another image here, maybe.
Nope, later.
Yep. So that's okay. So student responses.
Looking at how students can respond creatively. I mean, and Jen's already given some ideas about having them working in groups and providing responses. And the one that we know the most is they respond by text. They go onto the Google form, or they go onto the discussion forum, and they type their response. This we know. One of the things that we do recommend is that when you are getting the students to respond, is get them to respond not only to the task you've given them, but also to someone else's response. And that way it kind of keeps the conversation going. And you may need to encourage the students to go beyond, oh, I agree with you. If you think about a real discussion, if you're in a group of people and you have one individual just going, yeah, I agree. Yeah. They're not really giving much to the conversation. So you want to try to encourage the students to say, if you agree, say agree, and then maybe add an extra point. Yes, and something else. Again, try to keep the conversation going. So that's one way, through text. But there are others. For example, you might want to get the students to respond using audio. Maybe you have a podcast you create for the class and they can all go in and add a section to the podcast. Or maybe they just use their phone and they record a response, their own particular reflection. They can take that file and very quickly put it onto their Google Drive. And then from there, just like a Google Doc, they can make a link and they can put the link into the discussion forum. So people can click on the link and listen to what they were saying. Similarly, they could use a video. They can make a video up. I've suggested Biteable, and it may not work for everyone. Biteable is a little animation program you can make, which lets you make little titles and little animations. It's free. It's pretty simple, and it's been approved by the powers that be at the university. So it's worth looking into. And like I said, it is free. So students can take their work, put it onto YouTube, make it a private YouTube link, and then take that link and put that onto the discussion forum. Another option you might want to think about is maybe that students could make something that's graphical. Maybe they make a chart or a mind map of their thinking or an infographic. And again, they could put that onto Google Drive or just directly onto the discussion forum. And it's not a case of and or, like maybe it's a mixture. So maybe they make a mind map or a chart, but they also then type something. They actually have the text to explain it in more detail. So these are other options beyond just the traditional I'm typing a response that might engage the students when they are creating the response, but also might engage the students who are reading these responses. Now, we've talked about using the actual, we assume, e-class discussion forum, but there are other options. And Jen has one particular example she can explain.
So one thing that I tried out probably about 3 years ago was to have students engage through blogging. So you could take students' responses through discussion right out of eClass if you wanted. And you could create, Graham helped me with this. We did this on a WordPress site. It's free for students. It's a little, it's a lot of uptake to get everybody registered and in there and all that kind of stuff. So if that's something you're considering, please book a consultation with Graham or I, and we'll help you through that. Because that was a lot of time to set up. But what I love about it is that the students can actually write something. They could do this in groups, right? You could still do this in groups or as individuals, and then they respond to each other through that. And then the students always have access to this discussion later. You don't have to make this public. It doesn't have to be public for others outside of your group to see. But I do like this because you can have images. Textually, it looks better. Visually, it looks better. They could create an audio file if they wanted, or a video. And it would be actually, what I have found is that it's a really great assignment. And the students said, some feedback I got was, I thought it was going to be harder than it was. So that was great to hear.
One of the questions that we get asked at CTL is, if we're doing discussion forums, what do I say in a discussion forum, and when should I say it? Very good point. So I'd just like to go through one or two little points that may be helpful for you. The research that I'm looking at is really interesting because it talks about presence, but not presence. And what I mean by that is, how do you be present in a forum without taking over, without being seen as being heavy-handed or being in the way? And that's a challenge. And one of the ways that I would recommend you look at that is by following a very simple rule, that questions are greater than statements. It's easy to make a statement. It's easy to say, oh, you haven't quite got that right. Here's the right answer. Or, okay, good. Also think about this, this, this. If you turn them into questions, what about? What would happen if? What do you think about? Etc. It helps to remotivate the conversation, but then it's not you necessarily taking over. Because one of the things you need to remember is the student's perception. The student's perception is, it doesn't matter what you think and what you say to the students verbally. In a discussion forum, whether you mean it or not, students will take your response as the correct answer. So sticking with questions and providing a correction if needed, such as, this is an interesting point you made. What about the reading we've done? Does that match up to what we've read in the past? Or does that match up to this? Asking questions helps them to self-reflect rather than just sitting back and passively getting a response from you. So it's worth thinking about. Some interesting, before I go any further. So I have one more point, but I'm going to get to this first. I'm going to create some breakout rooms. And I've given you one, questions rather than statements. But I'd like you to think about what are some other ways that you can provide presence rather than presence, if that makes sense. So I'm going to create some breakout rooms for us in just a moment. And then it's just a conversation with your colleagues to talk about how can you have presence without having presence.
I think it's important to think about what is our intention versus our impact, right? So our intention might be to guide and support students, but we might be actually doing too much guidance. And what's the impact of over guiding?
Welcome back, everyone. The chat is open. So what we'd like you to do is to share some of your responses in the chat so we can all learn from each other. Oh, some really interesting things here. Yeah, be encouraging rather than directive. That's really good, Corey. Cultivating a culture of conversation is so important. Absolutely.
Consider using Jamboard. Yeah, you could use Padlet as well.
Yeah. I think Shona makes a good point there, talking about finding a balance between no presence and too much presence. And that is a challenge. And there's no easy answer. It all depends on the cohort and the topic and the subject. And there's a lot of variables there. Respond using follow-up questions. Yeah.
Some discussion about breakout rooms, popping in a bit late, so the convo has started without me. I was talking to Ellen, our colleague, about this, and there's just no easy way to go into a Zoom breakout room in a nice, gentle fashion and not interrupt a conversation, right? That's difficult. Concern about evaluating.
Yeah.
Point out link students' responses to one another's. Yeah, fantastic.
Really good conversations taking place by the sound of it. Fantastic. I'm going to just run ahead now and go on to the next slide. Research by Mazzolini and Madison was very interesting. It's an article, I have it in the links at the bottom. Fascinating article. And it talked about the prominent instructor role, basically presence and not presence. And the research was saying that the more prominent the instructor role, the more that they are bold present, the fewer the students are going to post. And it kind of links to what I was saying about making statements rather than questions. If people just know you're going to be answering the question eventually, then there's a way for you to answer it. So the more bold presence, the more prominence you have in a forum, the students are going to be posting less. But interesting. The other aspect of this is that frequent but not prominent instructor post means the quiet presence or the quieter presence, the students' perception of those particular instructions, but that they were more enthusiastic and they were displaying greater expertise in their subject. Now, I thought that was very interesting. So worth considering. Like I said, the research I have it in the link at the bottom. It's worth reading. It's quite interesting.
So do you think, Graham, that students maybe felt more emboldened to write and to say more if they knew that the instructor wasn't there kind of lurking in the background?
It was in a case of lurking. I think it's more a case of how instructors are viewed as providing support. Is that support giving the answer eventually, or is it just encouraging more discussion by asking good questions and by I call them thought bombs, which is throwing in a statement which is going to get a reaction, not a visceral reaction and not necessarily an emotional reaction, but it's asking a question which makes them go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And it gets the conversation starting again. So students will respond to that gentle approach and that kind of supportive approach rather than the information giving approach, to use that. That's the best phrase to use.
So using threads. So what to say and when. So Graham, I'll let you advance. Thank you.
Thanks.
So how do we thread discussions effectively? And some of you are probably already very well adept at doing this. This was my first time having group-led discussions. And so the threads became unwieldy. They got out of control because I didn't set the parameters appropriately for students. I didn't lay out the instructions properly. And so I'll show you what that looks like here in a minute. I think I show you wise practice first, and then what it looked like as it was unwieldy. This management of unwieldy threads, I had to go in and say, give an example. This is how we're going to do it from this point forward so that we can keep all of the weekly discussions in one area rather than having students respond to questions outside of the thread and creating new threads. Because technically in my class, I should only see 10 main threads and then click in there to see the whole discussion. But what it actually looked like is a million postings within that whole discussion board. And so it became quite unmanageable, and that becomes unmanageable for me to mark. So Graham, I'll just ask you to advance, please. So I know this is hard to see, but this is what ended up happening. So I took a screenshot and said, this is what I need you to do, right? So I don't want you to add a new discussion topic. I want you to reply to these questions so that we can keep them contained. So this is what they needed to look like. So you can see in our week 9 discussion, there were 65 replies. I have 60 students in the course, but of course they don't all have to respond this week. And they were having really great discussions, and then they could see each other's responses and respond to a question, but then also respond to one of their classmates' questions or responses as well. So here's what the unwieldy, and I couldn't give you the whole snapshot because that would take up pages and pages of this slideshow, but this is just a representation of that. So here we have the week 1 response, then somebody answering question 2, another person answering question 2, and then somebody in the group 4 discussion, and it just looks disorganized. And then no one knows where they actually need to be and where they need to go for the different weekly conversations. So I learned a lot from doing this. I learned what kind of might work better, but I'm sure some of you also have some solutions to that as well. So thinking about Indigenous ethos and engagement practices. So for any of you that have come to any session, I will talk long and in many different, situations about Wekotowin and how this is the ethos of my teaching practice. This is the ethos of my work as an educational developer. And so Wekotowin is a natural law, but it's a concept. And so it means being in relationship with human and more than human relatives, being in respectful relationships. There needs to be relational accountability. So how am I accountable to you, and how are you accountable to me? And how are we responsible for one another in our online learning space? And I do this in face-to-face classes as well. And so what I do is I start off with 3 Indigenous readings from Robin Wall Kimmerer from Braiding Sweetgrass. And so I do Sky Woman, Council of Pecans, and The Gift of Strawberries. And these 3 stories situate us and position ourselves in an Indigenous worldview. So how are we caretaking for one another in this co-learning space? How are we both teachers and learners in this space? What does it mean to have responsible dialogue with each other? What does it mean for there to be no competition in this space? I don't need you to show me that you can outwit someone else in this discussion space. What I need to see is that you can collaborate with other people. You can carry on thoughtful dialogue and meaningful dialogue, and you can add to the conversation rather than taking away from the conversation. So setting up these expectations from the very beginning is vitally important. And I'm sure many of you do this, but I have found situating myself with an Indigenous worldview and supporting the students in that has actually been really fruitful, and it leads to more collaboration. And so this collaborative process, the students have bought into it. They're engaging with each other. They're having good conversations. They're asking great questions of each other. And so I also created a hallway forum, and I can't take credit for this idea. I was following, at the height of the pandemic, there were all of these educator Facebook sites that you could go to, and people were sharing stories and sharing best practices, and the hallway forum was one of those things. So I'll let Graham go to the next slide. So I essentially have this image, and I've set up a discussion board, so just like any other discussion board, and it's just open. So the students can go in there, they can ask questions of each other, they can find one another if they want to talk about something. And so I call this an unmoderated space, but I want to use that term loosely or lightly. I'm not moderating the space to assess them. I want it to be as safe as a space we can create. I know, and I put safe in quotation marks because there's no such thing as a completely safe space. But I tell them this is not a space where racism lives. This is not a space where you're going to carry on in hurtful dialogue, and you need to be responsible in this space. So when I'm going in there, I'm looking to see that they're being responsible and that I can call to attention if I needed to about the rules of engagement that we set up in the beginning. However, this space has been great. The students were finding each other for their final projects. They were asking questions about what was going on in class, if someone missed class or they didn't understand something from the lecture. And it was actually nice. I had fewer questions of, I don't understand this, because they were going there to have this dialogue with each other. And you don't have to call it the hallway. You could call it the water cooler. You could call it the fire pit. I don't know, whatever you wanted to, you could call it. Graham, I'll let you advance. So giving feedback. So of course it's important, right? We all know that we need to give all different types of feedback, right? We need to at times restate our instructions. We need to think about what does the class need for feedback? What do groups, if we're having discussion groups, what do individuals need, right? So the fall term, about halfway to 3/4 of the way through, when I was looking, I recognized a pattern. And the pattern was that one particular student was not responding to the discussion forums at all. I had 50 students in that course. And so I was like, well, this is interesting. And so I had to connect with that student. What's going on? Why aren't you engaging in the forums? What do we need to do now that you've missed all these forums? What can we do, right? So the student shared with me what was going on. They'd had a bad experience in another course over the discussion forums. And they didn't want to share their ideas in the discussion because they felt like it wasn't a respectful space, what they'd experienced before. And so I wished we'd been able to have that conversation, and I needed to attend to that after the first couple of discussion forums to see that pattern. And so that was something that I look at now, right? I go back and think about who's engaging and who isn't. You could give audio feedback. I've done that before, where I've just recorded on my phone and then uploaded that. It was a time where I was so fatigued and I didn't want to write another thing, right? Video. So sometimes I'll record through video, just through Zoom, right? I'll record my feedback. I'll do it written through the announcements, but I'll also address it in lecture the following week, saying, this is what I saw. These were the conversations, give positive, give some reinforcement, but also how can we create an even better discussion? What might, if we thought about it in this perspective, how might that have changed the conversation? And what might we want to take up with those resources for this week that hasn't been taken up? And so, yeah, so addressing the absent student, right? That's something, that we need to be more attentive to. At least I know I do.
Just to add to that, in the chat, Heather asked the question, could you talk about the phone recording and upload? Is it just attaching an MP3 to the forum? One of the things that I know the IST will encourage you not to do is to put an audio file or a video file directly into eClass. eClass has its own little computer system, and video and audio takes up a lot of memory, and that's where things can sometimes crash. Also, it doesn't work very well on phones and like iPads and so on. So the recommendation is that if you do create a audio file on your phone, a phone recording or a video, to maybe make a folder in your Google Drive and to put the audio file or the sound file, the video file there. And just like you do with a Google Doc, you can share it. You can say it's open to anyone at the university. You can open it up any way you want. And then you just take that link. And then in the forum, you say, here's my link to my audio, and you just paste in the link. And that way it will run through Google, which is at the moment unlimited. And we know it will work on a phone and a tablet and a computer and so on without any problems. So that's one way of solving that particular issue. And it's pretty simple. I think most people will know how to take a video or an audio and to put it into Google or into YouTube. And if they don't, there are millions of videos on YouTube to show you how to do that. And if you're really stuck, you can always ask one of us and we can help and walk you through it too, as can IST.
I just put it in the Google folder, put the link in my eClass and label it appropriately. And I put it in the announcement as well. I link it into the announcement so that, because sometimes students don't read surprisingly, sometimes students don't read the emails from their professors. And so I try to put it in more than one space, right? So that they know that it's there. So we have a question for you and you can feel free. I think the chat is open, correct, Graham? It is open. Yes. So what do you do if a student or students go rogue in a discussion thread? What are some solutions to that? And rogue, you can define that, but I'm thinking, what if they're not on task? What if they're responding in inappropriate ways? What if they're starting side conversations or getting into fights through the discussion board? Yeah, remind them of the rules, restate the objectives, call them out, have them removed. You might, depending on the severity of the situation. And that might be something where you need to go to your chair, your, program lead, something like that, to have those conversations. Because I think those are multifaceted situations between what is appropriate for removing a student, depending on their behavior. Yeah, comments have to be addressed. We can't just leave them hanging. We must address those things, but even if they are super difficult to address, it's imperative that we need to ensure that all students are as safe as possible.
And this is why, as Jen was saying earlier on, it is so important at the beginning of your course, both verbally and written down, maybe in your course handbook, in eClass, in many different places, is to put down the expectations of behavior. And of course, you'll always have one or two that will not read it or will still not follow that. But you also want to make sure that as the instructor, you've covered yourself by saying this was made very clear what the expectations were, and that has not been followed. And therefore, if it does get to a severe situation where there's a sanction, at least there is evidence that there has been the information given to the student about the expectations.
The other thing that I like to do, and this is really an Indigenous response to these sorts of situations, is to hold a justice circle, because not only all the students have been affected, right? So how do we work out these issues together? How do we call people in without calling them out? How do we, ensure that everybody is able to say, like, this is how I was harmed, this is what happened, and work on co-create a solution together, right? And I think that, obviously there are maybe some implications with calling out a student in a in a space with everybody there. But I think it's like, if we have stated the rules of engagement, I think we can actually work through, and that teaches students a lot to work through those issues. They're going to have those in the workplace, and they've probably had them on Facebook yesterday, right? So we're really here to teach, to help them through these situations.
So very, really thought-provoking responses there. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts there. This last bit is just to talk about some other considerations, some of which we've already talked about. So this is going to be pretty fast. Think about workload from 2 points of view. One, think about your own workload, because if you're going to have a discussion forum, you do have to have a presence. Again, not the big presence, but you want to have a presence. And it does take time. It takes time to go in and check and make sure that everything's okay. You might not be going in and responding to every single comment. I would argue you shouldn't be anyway, but you still have to spend time doing that. So when you are creating these, think about your workload. In the before times, I would probably be saying maybe you don't have to have a discussion forum every week. However, because the discussion forums are now a really good way to get students to interact and to build up that community, you may want to do it every week. And that makes a lot of sense. But just be aware of how it affects your workload. And then the other side of that is, how does it affect the student's workload? So be aware of that as well, because they've got your class, they may have 4 or 5 other classes, and if they're doing discussion forums and it's taking them 3 or 4 hours every week times 5 or 6 classes, that's a lot of time. So just be aware of the workload for yourself and for the students, and make your own professional judgment on what's appropriate. We've already talked about a bit of online safety, which also links to just thinking about the rules of engagement. So just be aware of that. Consider that when you are creating your discussion forum. Make sure that there is something which makes it very clear what the expectations are and what those rules are for engaging. Again, as we've talked about, I think we'd all agree it's incredibly important to think about the Indigenous ways of learning. As Jen has said, as other comments have come in, is there are other ways of managing students when things don't go as well as you would like, or when there are issues. So it's worth reflecting on that. And importantly, to think about equity, diversity, and inclusivity. How do you ensure that everyone feels included in these conversations? And that's not an easy question to answer either. And we're very happy to help you talk through some of these things and to support you with that. And if you're interested, I'll give you a link on how you can contact us for more support.
It's also about your course design. So decolonization, indigenization, equity, diversity, and inclusivity should all be within your course design anyway. Right, so this is just another piece of that course design.
And these links will be available. I have a PDF version of this that you're welcome to take. I'll put it in the chat in just a moment, so you can download that right away. But it'll also be available next week on our CTL website. Just so you know, you can get hold of us at ctl.ualberta.ca. We've just updated our webpage. We're quite proud of it. You'll see a little animation of me on the front page. Feel free to mock me because it's pretty funny. But all the information is there about supporting students in the, certainly in this case, in the implementation section. You'll see at the bottom of the main page is an implementation section. There's a whole bunch of stuff there that we'll be helping you out with, and we'll be putting this particular video in that section too. You can also email us at ctl@ualberta.ca, and you can also ask for a consultation by going to ctl.guide/consultation request.
I just want to go back to Lucinda's question, because it's a really excellent question about how can settler instructors use, for example, these Sweetgrass teachings from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and just ensure that it's appropriate, it's not appropriated, right? And so I think I would like to say that I have lots of resources on the Indigenous website that you can go to familiarize yourself with that. I'm happy to have a consultation with you to think about how that might work in your particular context. But you are able to take what you've learned here, what you've learned about Wekotowin. Maybe there are other Indigenous teachings that you're aware of that have been gifted to you from elders and knowledge keepers or other professional development that you've undertaken. And you can bring that into your praxis, right? You are able to do that and say, this is something I've learned from so-and-so. So always give your acknowledgement and the credit to whom you've learned that from. And then bring that forward into your own teaching practice. So the elders say, Wekotowin is for everyone. This is our natural law. This is the ways in which we engage with the world around us, with our human and other than or more than human kin, right? And so this is really a worldview. And we love it if people take this and adopt this into their own practice. And the sweetgrass, braiding sweetgrass readings are the same way. So you might read those and have a different perspective. There might be something that you can glean from those readings and bring into your own practice about relationship, about responsibility, about your kinship obligations, right? And so that's okay. You can certainly do that. Thank you everyone for coming. It was such a pleasure to see you all here today.